This is Alloway in Ayrshire, birthplace of Robert Burns, Scotland's national bard.
Every year on the 25th of January, a lot of us celebrate Burns Night. People hold Burns suppers, recite poetry and eat haggis. I'd never really been into Burns. He's a bit like algebra. It's hard to be passionate about something you're forced to learn in school. But I also never knew much about him. And what I did know was quite wrong in places. Then I rediscovered Tam O'Shanter, Burns's dark gothic masterpiece about a slightly drunken man on his way home who happens upon a coven of witches and the devil celebrating something in Alloway's old haunted kirk, which is just over there. Tam has to make his escape over the water here at the Brig of Doon. Anyway, having done a bit more digging, I think quite a lot of us have him wrong in bits. So I thought I'd go on a bit of a road trip to see where he lived and where he died and how he wound up there at the age of only 37.
And along the way, we might just bump into a modern day Ayrshire farmer.
Welcome to Scotland Unplugged, on the trail of Robert Burns.
Burns was born here in this cottage on the 25th of January 1759. He was the oldest of 7 children. William Burns was a tenant farmer from Dunnottar. He was ambitious and self-educated. Burns' mother, Agnes Brown, was the daughter of a tenant farmer closer to home. Farming was very definitely in the blood, but it wasn't an easy life, and that would eventually take its toll.
William Burns actually built the house here behind me, but by Easter 1766, when Rabbie was just 7, the family sold up and moved to a 70-acre farm, Mount Oliphant, just down the road. William was big on self-improvement, and he educated his family in reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, and of course, religion. In 1763, John Murdoch, a young teacher, opened an adventure school in the village and taught Latin, French and maths, none of which sound like too much of an adventure to me, but probably did when the alternative was hard farm work in the days before fun things like tractors and quad bikes.
Adventure schools were unregulated and usually did the best they could for local pupils. Robert and his brother Gilbert carried on their education there. It was patchy. They were back and forth a bit, depending on the needs of the farm. By the time Burns Jr. was 15, he was the chief labourer at Mount Oliphant, and during the harvest that year, he'd have some help from a girl who'd go on to inspire his first poem, Handsome Nell, also known as Oh Once I Loved a Bonny Lass. That was the beginning of a recurring theme. Times were tough though, and in what would become a bit of a pattern, in 1777, William moved the family to another farm, Lochlee, near Turbolton. He seems to have been a hard worker, and he obviously wasn't daft, but things just weren't going his way.
Burns and his brother founded the Turbolton Bachelors Club and got right into country dancing. His father really didn't approve. Growing up in Scotland, I find that a tiny bit ironic, given that authority figures in school were constantly making us do Scottish country dancing. It doesn't really come into its own until you're drunk at a wedding. Burns was inducted into the local Masonic Lodge, something that would no doubt help him later on. He was restless and ambitious. He clearly wanted a lot more out of life. At one point, he moved to Irvine to become a flax dresser, someone who separates the coarse bits of flax from the fibres for spinning. It doesn't sound massively entertaining, and it came to an end when the workers held their New Year's celebrations and burned the flax shop to the ground. Burns was apparently one of the revellers. He met Richard Brown, a sea captain. His father really didn't approve of him. Obviously that meant Burns held him in pretty high regard, and the captain encouraged him to become a poet.
Things weren't running smoothly though. William was involved in a dispute with his landlord that ended up in the Court of Session in Edinburgh. Eventually, in 1784, they decided in his favour, but he died 2 weeks later. Robert and Gilbert tried to keep things going, but eventually moved on to Musgiel Farm near Mauchline. The farming was tough, but it was a creative period. Here, Burns would write some of his best known works.
This memorial behind me was built by the Mauchline Society of Glasgow and opened in 1898 near Mosgiel. The tower once held a museum and sits at the end of a street of houses, which you can see over there. They were built as homes for elderly people in the area. They're kind of a living memorial to the poet and a lasting legacy. While he was here, he met a group of women he'd christened the Belles of Mauchline. One of them was Jean Armour. Burns was a bit of a lover man. That part of his reputation is pretty fair. He's thought to have fathered 13 children. The first was his daughter Elizabeth, or Bess Burns. She was born to his mother's servant, Elizabeth Peyton, around the time he was romancing Miss Armour. Jean Armour's father was a hardy stonemason, but the thought of her marrying Burns meant that he was in the greatest distress and fainted away. And Jean was dispatched to Paisley to live with her uncle. Her father sued Burns, who wrote to his brother basically telling him he was couch surfing to avoid the long arm of the law.
Then Burns saw Mary Campbell, later known as Highland Mary, in church. It's thought they planned to marry and possibly exchanged Bibles and vows over the water here at Failford. Whatever happened, this is the place they parted. Mary went to Greenock to put her affairs in order and died of typhus. By 1786, he was running out of options. At one point, in probably the most controversial episode of his life, he accepted a job as a bookkeeper and overseer on a sugar plantation in Jamaica. Burns, who would become known as an egalitarian, who'd go on to write "A Man's a Man for All That," would have been overseeing slave labour. He didn't go, and we can't know how aware he would have been of the situation. What ultimately stopped him was a lack of funds for his passage. He decided to give his poetry a shot and published poems chiefly in a Scottish dialect on the 31st of July.
It was a big gamble, but it paid off. His collection was an instant success. He travelled to Edinburgh, where he was embraced by the literary scene, and he wasn't daft. He had a bit of marketing savvy about him, and he played up to contemporary notions of the noble peasant. He'd recite poetry in front of silk stocking gatherings in his boots.
This is Ladies' Stairs Close, just off the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, home to the Writers' Museum. Here you can see various artefacts from the poet's life and death, including a plaster cast of his skull. While he was here, Burns made quite an impression on a 15-year-old Walter Scott.
His person was strong and robust, his manners rustic, not clownish, a sort of dignified plainness and simplicity, which received part of its effect, perhaps from knowledge of his extraordinary talents. I realise it might be quite difficult to picture a contemporary farmer reciting poetry in his work here.
So, here's a contemporary farmer reciting poetry in his work here.
Hi folks, Cammy here from the Sheep Game. Bob asked me to do him a little Robert Burns poem, of course, to celebrate the Bard. 25th of January is the great man's birthday. So I thought we'd do two alouse upon seeing one on a lady's bonnet at church. And this poem by Robert Burns contains, in my opinion, the greatest line he ever wrote. And here we go. Ho! Where are you going? You crowling fairly. Your impudence protects you sairly. I canna say, but you strunt rarely over gauze and lace. Though faith, I fear you dine but sparely on sic a place. You ugly, creeping, blasted worra. Detested, shunned by saunt and sinner. How dare you set your foot upon so fine a lady? Gae somewhere else and seek your dinner, on some pear biddy. Swith, in some beggar's half at squattle. There you may creep and sprawl and sprattle with other kindred jumping cattle and shoals and nations, where horn or bane ne'er dare unsettle your thick plantations. Now hold you there, you're out of sight, below the fatrel snug and ticht. Ah, faith ye, yet you'll no be wrecked until you've got on it, the very topmost towering hecht, oh Mrs. Bonnet. By sooth, recht bald ye set your nose out, as plump and grey as ony grows it. Oh, for some rank mercurial roset, or fell red smedum, would gie ye suck a hearty dose it, would dress your drodum. I wouldn't have been surprised to spy ye in an old wife's flaming toy, or Abel and some bit Diddy boy owns Wiley coat, but Mrs. Fine Lanardi, fie, how dare you do it? Oh, Jenny, dinna toss your head and set your beauties all abreed. You little ken what cursed speed the blasties makin'. They winks and finger ends a dreeder notice takin'. Oh, with some power the gifty gies to see ourselves as others see us. It would for many a blunder free us and foolish notion. What airs and dress and gate melias and e'en devotion. You might have heard some sheep coughing in the background there, there's a shed full of them behind me. But that line at the end there by Burns, oh, with some power the gifty gies to see ourselves as others see us. And if you're not from Scotland, to translate that slightly means, oh, what a power it would be for God to give us the ability to see ourselves as other people see us. You know, if you could step back and look at yourself and look at your actions, what a gift that would be. And that was written by Robert Burns many, many years ago. So yeah, what a man, an absolute legend of Ayrshire. All the best, folks.
And that's how it's done. The collection did well, and it was reprinted. Alexander Naismith painted him looking suitably agricultural for a later edition of the book. Burns sold the rights, and ever the farmer's son had his mind on sheds and acres.
This is Elsland Farm, near Dumfries. In 1788, Burns married Jean Armour, and they came here and he built her the cottage you can see behind me, and a buyer.
Here, he set down Auld Lang Syne on paper, after saying he heard it from an old man in a pub.
These days, Elsland Farm is actually a museum. You can walk in Burns' footsteps and see the place where he came up with a lot of his best work. And it's thought this is the path he walked along as he worked out the words to Tam O'Shanter. Pretty cool. He'd go on to write and collect numerous songs, and to make life more stable, he asked some influential friends to get him a position as an exciseman, a taxman. Back then, that was less about Microsoft Excel and forms and more about carrying a gun and chasing smugglers.
This is a stick he carried at the time.
Inside was a three-edged blade, designed to leave a nasty wound that wouldn't heal easily, meaning that if you were on the run, you were easily caught. This is the Globe Inn in Dumfries. Burns described it as his house. Here he'd drink and dine and entertain his friends, and sometimes stay if work brought him here. He'd read the news, freshly arrived in town, and hold court, and he conducted at least one extramarital affair with Anna Park, the landlady's niece.
Here you can see the room he slept in, and maybe just about make out the messages he etched on the windows with a diamond stylus.
You can actually sit in his chair, but you're obliged to either recite some poetry or buy the whole bar a round of drinks. So when Chapman Billies leave the street and Drouthy Neebers meet, as market days, I can't remember the rest of it. There you go, that's a line of poetry.
A round of applause.
He'd hang out at the Theatre Royal just over the road with some of his more radical friends. But again, he wasn't daft. There's some debate over whether he sympathised with the French Revolution and republicanism, but when the threat of invasion came along, he joined the local militia. Maybe to keep his employer sweet, maybe for patriotic reasons. We'll never know.
Things didn't work out well long term at Elsland Farm. It was said that the ground was rough and stony and didn't yield much in return for the work. Burns moved his family to this house in Dumfries, then took ill.
Unable to work as an exciseman, he'd go to the Solway to bathe in the freezing water 3 times a day. He was intent on doing whatever he could to find a cure, but he was eventually confined to his room. In the next room, his wife was about to give birth to his 13th child that we know of. He'd never been in very good health as an adult, and some of his writing seems to show that he didn't believe he'd reach old age. He wrote the poem A Bard's Epitaph when he was only 27.
Robert Burns died on the 25th of July 1796, probably rheumatic heart disease. He was buried the same day his son, Maxwell Burns, was born.
A crowd attended the funeral, and he was carried by the men of the Royal Dumfries Volunteers.
He was laid to rest here in Poets' Corner in St Michael's Kirkyard, Dumfries. It's quite a place, even if you compare it to somewhere like Greyfriars in Edinburgh. It's all local Dumfries sandstone in that distinctive red hue. His original grave was modest. It was all his wife could afford.
Fittingly, there's a statue of the long-suffering Jean just over the road.
The pair had 9 children together, but only 3 of them survived into adulthood. Jean brought up Burns' daughter from his affair with Anna Park, who died. Following his death, she'd entertained visitors on a pilgrimage to see where he'd spent his last days. And the demand for souvenirs was so high, she had to break his deathbed into pieces. Despite the financial struggles in his lifetime, Burns was famous, and his family were well looked after.
In 1813, a fundraising campaign was put in place to build his mausoleum. The campaign really took off, and money came in from as far away as India and America. Walter Scott got involved, and George IV even chipped in a cheeky 50 guineas. I said there were 60 monuments to Burns, or over 60 monuments, but my favourite of the ones I've seen is very definitely this one.
This is the Burns Monument, back in Alloway.
Here, you get a fantastic view of the Brigadoon, where it all did, or, well, in reality didn't happen. But, having been filming here for a while, there's quite a lot of activity on it today. I suppose the reason I was never into Burns was that we were encouraged to recite his poetry in school every year, in front of the school. I never got why this guy with what I saw as a dodgy 70s haircut was so interesting, just because he spoke in Scots. I grew up in Scotland. What was the big deal with that? But the more I dig into his life, the more interesting he is. Academics and writers argue and debate about who he was and what he was, and these days whether he should be cancelled. But I think we'll be talking about him for a while yet.